Apocalypse. Finally the time had come. Heaven and earth steadied for the coming chaos. Lucifer himself could feel the essence of the earth shifting and put the Black Third on high alert. For years he had searched for the Purger of worlds, and finally he will have his chance to prove to God that he still remains the greatest of all creation. For he was the one who had a third of heaven standing with him against the Creator of all things. Lucifer took pride in knowing that the lower earth realm had become so corrupted that David had to appear upon the earth. Even so, he was determined to show his power supreme. The entire world was at war and the apex was finally upon them all. David stood atop the palace tower in prayer for 3 hours without moving. When he was finished he shouted with a loud voice, and his light exploded as a great flame. His eyes began to glow, and like a bolt of lightning he cut through the air at an impossible speed. The Numen warriors below cheered at the sight and sound of their champion, and in heaven the angelic host also rejoices. The ground and waters separated under his wake. Clouds twisted and turned as the air contorted at the speed of his flight. The wildlife below scurried to safety as if their homes could protect them from the carnage that is to come. It only took him 10 seconds to fly 10,000 miles. As he came upon the Red Sea, the waters parted and opened up to greet him. He descended down into the mystic city where the fairies were gathered around the house of Ariana praying. Rigel and Rose were excited and nervous at the sight of David. They could see that he had with him the holy sword of Ariana. All stood amazed at its beauty. When they saw the crown of Nuna upon his head they all bowed in humble submission. He touched down in the street and began to walk toward his house. Flower petals were cast at his feet as he walked as a sign of respect to his royalty. Rose ran up to him asking if he was okay and got no response. All he wanted to do was gaze upon his mother's shell once more before setting out for his destiny. As he entered her room there were candles lit around the bed where she laid. Her wound was dressed and she was clothed in a white garment. Ariana's face was still beautiful as if she was sleeping. The elder fairies were around her praying peace over her tormented soul. He closed his eyes and reached out with all of his senses until he could feel the soul of his mother. The suffering and torment of her soul was unspeakable, and David couldn't take it any longer. Suddenly he sent out a message to every citizen of Crimson simultaneously in his or her minds. My beloved friends, the time has come for me to fulfill my destiny. Make your peace with God while you still have time. Those who wish to stay will share the fate of the earth. Those who wish to be taken to another place need only to make their request known to the Father, and it shall be done. All things will be made new. Such is the will of God. With those final thoughts David began to finally let the rage consume him. The crimson waters above begin to boil and the sky begins to darken. Every second is as 1,000 years' torment for his mother inside the pit of Satan. He begins to glow once more and his golden eyes burn bright as he is carried up into the air. The waters above open at his coming. Once again he stands on the surface of the Red Sea as it boils under his feet. The angelic host in heaven all cheer again as the tension mounts in the essence of earth and heaven. The armies of Satan stood on guard and ready for his orders. Something was up and he could feel it. He could feel the earth traveling like a woman in labor. The giant lizard army began to mobilize in numbers that could not be counted. Lucifer decides to undergo a full-scale attack on the capital city of Nuna to finally rid the earth of human royalty. Little did he know that the full Nunan army from the north, south, east, and west were already primed and ready. Alnam had made the order to mobilize after King David made his appearance in the capital city. A sea of men stood ready behind the mighty walls of the Nunan capital's blessed walls awaiting orders. The other third of the army are posted on the other side of the great hill and are en route to the battlefield. War drums can be heard in the distance and a foul howling sound filled the afternoon air. Suddenly, a mile away from the city walls to the east, the ground began to shake as demon after demon claws their way up out of the earth. Creatures of all shapes and sizes begin to make their way toward the capital city. Goblins and ogres, giants and dragons alike march and fly in the direction of the great city. The trumpets of Nuna sound and Alnum commands the gates to be opened and rivers of men pour out to meet the enemy. Their battle cry is almost deafening. Pouring down the hill was the other epic wave of Nunan warriors of the north. 1,000 ships approach with the Nunan warriors of the west. Never has the entire world force been called into battle at the same time. This will truly be the battle of all battles. Flying overhead was Baal in the form of Tyron the Elder Dragon. The royal archers took their position on the rooftops and watchtowers and fired a wave of black arrows into the sky. Tyron blew fire and brimstone from his mouth, turning the third of the arrows into ash. Some arrows did hit him, wounding him, but not gravely. He hissed at his attackers and with a swing of his tail knocked down one of the watchtowers, sending it crashing down to the city below. The ships finally reach the shore and the savage warriors of the west run out of their ships toward the battle in a maddening frenzy, killing every creeping thing in sight. The western army wore a menacing black armor. The northern soldiers wore red armor and the royal guard wore silver, all bearing the seal of Nuna on their shields. Back in Crimson, the fairies readied themselves for battle. They were a peaceful people but no strangers to the ways of war. The fairies wore no armor, only the white hooded garments. Some chose to meet their fates at home while others wanted to write their own destiny on the battlefield. Straightway, Rigel and Rose were carried up in a giant bubble high into the air and over the water. The rest of the fairy army flew under their own power. Their number was 20,000 and the light of them shone as a star upon the face of the earth. David was still standing upon the waters of the Red Sea watching the battle 10,000 miles away. Once the Crimson Army was ready and airborne, David commanded them forward and they made their way to the battlefield where the fighting had already began. Rigel and Rose are ready to slay their enemies for all of the trouble they have caused to this world. More importantly, for all of their friends and family lost. Vengeance would be paid in full for the torment of Ariana. Lindell and Wendell also joined them. They had shaved their heads and wore white hooded cloaks. They travel at a high speed, not nearly as fast as David had demonstrated, but fast enough. They begin to hear explosions and war cries in the distance. Then the smells of death and burning flesh reached their nostrils. The sight of the battle was almost overwhelming. Never had the world seen such conflict as mankind's greatest kingdom unites against the ultimate evil. Finally they are almost upon the city and their bubble drift down until it hits the ground. Rigel explodes and with a roar begins to tear through the ranks of the Black 3RD. His rage had been bottled up for 10 long years and now his princess, who he had protected since her birth, is worse than dead. They would surely taste his wrath on this day. His diamond axe was cutting through any and everything in its path. Rose climbs up his back and pulls out her slingshot and proceeds to pick apart the enemy one by one with flash bombs. This is it. She thought of her brother being eaten alive by these beasts, and all of the anger and pain she had suppressed through years of fairy training had finally ignited in an uncontrollable rage. Every time a lizard was destroyed, the demonic host inside would simply look for another lizard to possess and return to the battlefield. It was all fine to Rigel and Rose, and they would enjoy wiping the planet clean of every creeping thing if needed to satisfy their wrath. A troop of 3 7-foot Cyclops ogres rush Rigel from his blind side, but Rose sees their movements in time and taps Rigel 3 times on his back. Rigel then leaps high into the air and Rose fires smoke bombs below, blocking the vision of the group of ogres. With all of his weight, Rigel lands, crushing one ogre's skull and swinging his diamond axe, severing the heads of the others. Rose then fires flash bombs, turning their remains into ash before their bodies even fall to the ground. In the midst of the fighting, Alnum can be seen with Asik and Caldwell at his side, slaying lizard after lizard. These 3 mighty men lost someone dear to them, and now it's time for their final payback. They fight in a circle, leaving no back exposed. Warriors and friends since childhood, their lives much like their children's was filled with war and death. They look up and see the wall of light approaching and smile at the arrival of the Crimson Army. The rest of the white-cloaked hooded crimson army swoops into the battle, casting enchantments and slashing away with silver daggers. It had been hundreds of years since the fairies fought side by side with the sons of men. King David has seen enough, and with a shout blasts forward with such force, sending the waters of the Red Sea high into the air. The speed of his flight cannot be measured, but the sounds of thunder chased him all the way to the battle. When he arrives to the battlefield, the trumpets sound, and he is brighter than the very sun itself. Everyone stops for a moment to cover their eyes. The thunder booms at the arrival of the king. His light begins to fade, showing the young king with his face a look of anger and determination. The royal crown of Nuna resting on his head, signifying his position as King of Kings and Lord of Lords upon the earth. Fastened to his waist rests the crown of Ariana to his left and the diamond crown of thorns on his right. Across his back rests the diamond sword and the holy sword of Ariana. To the majority of the Nunan army, this would be the first time they lay eyes on their new king. Many stood in disbelief that a child could possess such power. They shield themselves as a river of fire and brimstone rains down upon them from the sky. Flapping wings can be heard as King David floats above the city dressed in white and glowing. He turns to see Baal Tyran challenging him. "So you're the one," he hissed. "You don't look so tough to me. I'm sure you will fall just as easily as your whore mother did." Wahahaha. His laugh was cut short by a fist going through his stomach. David had moved so fast that Tyran could not even react in time. Baal chokes in surprise and groans out in pain. David pulled his hand out and then pulled out his diamond sword, and with one swing severed Baal's head from his body. He then opens his mouth wide, and a blast of white divine power comes out and utterly consumes the body of the giant lizard, turning it into ash. The warriors of Nuna cheer loudly at the destruction of Tyran. The Black Third gasped at the sight of their high general being defeated so easily. The spirit of Baal wails as it looks for another host body. David is becoming agitated as every moment is precious. He turns his head to the south, and with a loud voice like seven thunders, he calls out, "Lucifer, son of the morning star! Show yourself, O vain spirit! The king of Nuna commands thee." The earth began to shake as never before. And lo, a huge beast rose up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. For the first time since the great angelic war stood the foulest of fowls himself. The original harbor of evil in the God's holy place, Nod challenges King David. His voice was the sound of a great bear and the growl of many wolves. "Foolish boy," Nod barked. "You cannot possibly fathom the agony your wretched mother suffers, but soon you shall share her fate, son of Ariana." Demon lizards scurry about beneath Nod's feet looking for trouble. Trouble finds them as more soldiers of Nuna and Crimson pour out onto the battlefield in numbers equaling the sands of the beach. "My battle is not with you, O host of evil," David says. "Stand aside and save yourself the embarrassment of inevitable defeat by my hands." Nod roars and readies himself to attack. He whips his tail, slicing through the air so fast it produces a thunderous resonant sound. He was not fast enough, as David's speed was even greater. He dodges the tail attack and unsheaths his diamond sword and crown of thorns. With one spinning motion he throws them faster than the fastest wind. The sword and crown takes flight in opposite directions and spins with such speed that they are seen as white discs severing the head of the beast that was speaking to David. Nod howls in pain and takes 3 steps back before crashing to the ground below, crushing the bodies of many of his comrades. Nod curses the name of David and his mother and his heavenly father and staggers back to his feet. He stomps his foot upon the earth and releases a violent chaos wave of black light from 3 of his mouths. The 3 beams converse into one epic beam and tears through the air at a blinding speed. David screams as his aura of light explodes, engulfing him in divine flames. He simply lifts one hand to counter Nod's blast. As the blast of death approaches David, Alnam and his high guard pause and look up in the sky, watching the two beings of power standoff. He never imagined that he would live to see the final end of the war. The sight of Nod alone was terrifying enough, but to know that Lucifer himself had been summoned to battle was something Alnam had always dreamed of seeing. His grandson, his champion, was the Purger of worlds. Alnam was made proud in that moment. The dark force wave reaches David and is smacked away as one would swat a fly. All 6 of Nod's heads gasp in surprise, and now horror, as his diamond crown, spinning as a disc of red death, flies and severs 3 more heads, sending them crashing onto the beach below and rolling into the sea. Nod cries out in pain and whips his armored tail around again, but this time David is ready and for the first time unsheathes the sword of Ariana. The light of it is almost blinding, as the power of the ultimate weapon is in the hands of the ultimate warrior and is felt by friend and foe alike. Along with the light, a sound is heard that had never before been heard upon the face of the earth. The demons below shriek at the sight of the sword, and Alnam smiles wide in anticipation of what the sword and David together are really capable of. Lightning flashes and thunder rolls as David Emmanuel moves faster than light and severs the tail of the beast and the 3 remaining heads, followed by the 2 hind legs, all in the same time it takes one to blink an eye. All stand in shock of what they had just witnessed. Nod is severely injured but still inhabits the body of the beast. David floats back into the air. His white cloths are now red with the blood of his enemy. His rage is still growing. He yells aloud once again. "O vain and unclean spirit, show yourself, accuser of men." David shouts in a loud voice. "Show yourself upon the earth, fallen one. I command thee." David shouts as the skies begin to groan ominously dark. The demonic host began to cheer at the imminent arrival of their leader. The one who challenged God in his holy place and lived. "Command me," said a voice of 1,000 shadows. "I am the one who commands." A large pillar of black smoke appears in the air, followed by a low howl. A mighty rushing wind from the 4 corners of the earth all meet at the pillar, and lighting flashes inside, but no thunder is heard. As the darkness vanishes, there floated one figure. An epic display of dark power swirled in the air. Once again Lucifer, the former Anon archangel, appeared in the presence of mortals. To look upon him, as a man, was almost too overwhelming, as the soldiers of Nuna were frozen with astonishment in the presence of the greatest being ever created by the hand of God himself. Even the demon lizards paused in fighting to bow at the presence of their leader. Lucifer wore the same old black cloak from many ages ago in that epic battle. The crown he wore on his head was in itself an abomination to the Father. His enormous wings were a sight to behold, and he apparently did not need them to stay afloat in the air. Once the beacon of perfect praise and worship, he was now a shallow husk of his former self. Even in his disgraced condition he was easily far beyond human comprehension. It was said that the collective praise and worship from every being in every world could only equal the output he himself produced when he walked with God. The surface of his skin flowed like living light and sound. However, his vanity was even greater than ever before, and to himself he was more worthy to be glorified than when he covered the throne of God. Lucifer wore a scowl on his still perfect face. "Who are you to command me?" Lucifer spat. His back turned to King David as a sign of disrespect. "You know exactly who and what I am and why I'm here." David responded. "I am here to cleanse the earth, but first." "Ah yes, great Purger, but of course," Lucifer says, trying to hold off his vile laughter. "You have something I want and I have something you want. How about an even trade? Let's see, the sword of Ariana for the soul of Ariana. What say you, son of man?" Lucifer turns around to face David, smirking and showing his perfect teeth. Everyone below is still frozen in awe of these two beings of divine power. The king stands unfazed by the size and beauty of the Anon. David begins to glow dark red. Finally his wrath will be unleashed upon all the earth. I will make no such deals with the devil. Today you shall be trodden under my foot. David says as his wrath explodes, and he moves so fast he appears as a blur to the soldiers below. He strikes Lucifer across his face with his fist, and Lucifer is knocked back a few feet before catching himself. Lucifer feels the left side of his face in shock that he had even been touched. He could not fathom that someone had dared touch his face, his beautiful face. He screamed in rage as his angelic light exploded in white and purple colors. The soldiers of Nuna shielded their eyes because he had become brighter than the very sun itself, even brighter than King David had previously been upon his arrival. Lucifer's rage caused the seas to boil and the winds to race about him. David stood unconcerned, for his eyes were like no other eyes upon the face of the earth. He spread his wings out wide, and the shadow he casted below became a place of death. Whosoever was found in the shadow of Lucifer was overtaken by death in that very moment. Lucifer then pulled a long curved black sword out of his mouth. Its handle was covered in black pearls, and its blade was hot, and smoke came out of it as it burned the very air it touched. This sword is the key of death. The devil shouted. With it I, Lucifer, shall cleanse this earth, starting with you, son of Ariana the doomed. David's rage overflowed once again, and he shouted with a loud voice, and a beam of white divine concussive force pulsed out of his mouth. The beam hits Lucifer in his chest with the force of 1,000 mountains and sends him flying down and crashing into the sea below. The soldiers of Nuna begin to cheer as the demonic host begins to retreat in fear. Not in the fear of David, but in the fear of their master's coming wrath. David floats in their air, looking over the water and waiting for Lucifer to appear. His crown lifts off of his head and begins to spin inches above his head as if it is not worthy to rest upon his head. He is becoming less man and more divine by the second. The waters of the sea begin to boil again and turn dark red. The waters were far darker than the red waters of the Red Sea as the devil's rage brewed in its depths. The skies grow darker and the earth begins to shake once again. Suddenly a huge black beam of force pulses out of the water and crashed into David faster than he could move, sending him hurling into a mountain 30 miles away. His body struck the mountain with such force that the mountain collapsed in on itself, causing the earth to shake even more. The dust cloud can be seen climbing high into the air from his impact. A loud roar is heard as the dragon himself returns. Lucifer, now the brimstone dragon, exits the water with one massive flap of his 200-foot wingspan. Nod was an impressive beast to behold, but to the soldiers of Nuna and even to the king Alnam, the sight of Lucifer in this form was nothing short of absolute wonder and terror. Alnam knew David was right. All of the armies of the world would have been crushed by this beast that stood over 100 feet tall with 7 heads and 7 crowns. In his hand held the sword, now enlarged with him. He began to smite the soldiers of Nuna who tried running away. The archers of the west fired upon him, but to no avail. Their arrows were turned into ashes as soon as they touched him. The fairies attacked from the air and were swatted away like flies. The dragon not only breathed fire hotter than any fire on earth, but it also breathed the wind of death itself. The beast could potentially destroy the world, and no army of men can stop it. Alnam prayed to God for David as the dragon was now upon him and his men. The devil roared and raised his sword high into the air to bring death upon the king, and as his hand came down, a white flying disc came from nowhere, severing this hand from his body. The dragon roared aloud and stepped back in pain. The sword and severed hand fell to the earth with a loud clang. David lands next to Alnam, telling him that the time is drawing near. Alnam finds Asik, Caldwell, Rigel and Rose and continues his assault against the enemies of Nuna. David takes to the skies once again to meet his adversary. Satan growls and shoots a blast from the mouths of all 7 heads. David pulls out the sword of Ariana to deflect the blast, and the beam connects, causing a ripple in the essence of the earth. The angelic host in heaven watch on as the events unfold below. The mighty door of the one from beyond begins to open and all eyes in heaven turn in that direction in anticipation. Down below, the epic conflict is taking its toll on the earth. Man and beast colliding in all-out war, and two beings more powerful than any man or beast trading blows that shake the earth to its very core. Lucifer is losing. Every attack from Lucifer on the Noonan army is thwarted by David's hand. Every direct attack against David is met with an even more devastating counter. The devil began to curse God and David, and one of the heads began to tell tales of his mother's torment. The king could take no more. David began to sever the dragon's heads one by one with the holy sword. The rivers of the earth now run red with the blood of the fallen. Man, beast, and fairy fighting without rest. Finally, there is only one head left on the great dragon. The devil pleaded with David to halt his attack because he had a gift for him. David floats down to the ground and is aflame with divine fire once again as a great living inferno. The dragon opens his mouth, and out from his mouth is the sound of great torment and weeping. It is the sound of his mother's tormented soul being ravaged and tortured without rest. The sounds of her cries become drowned by laughter from the dragon and the demon lizards scurrying below. Finally, the last seal of King David's rage is broken, and with a shout as the voice many roaring thunders and chaos, David bolts through the air and into the mouth of the beast and down his throat. His eyes can now see both the natural as well as the spirit realm. Inside the belly of the dragon was a fire pit prison filled with worms and maggots and all manner of creeping things. There were many souls screaming in torment, but he locked in on one. He came upon a great spiritual abyss. A dark smoke-filled bottomless pit. Its depths could not be measured, and its torments cannot be spoken or written. It can only be described as everlasting oblivion. King David dives into the sea of darkness to rescue his mother. His body begins to glow the deeper into the void he goes. He finally locates the remains of his mother's heart, and by his power frees her soul. The devil feels her essence leave him and roars aloud. "Impossible!" he bellowed. David curls up and begins to channel divine energies as never before. Suddenly Lucifer's belly began to expand, and a light could be seen growing inside. The light began to slowly expand inside his body, causing his body to become unstable. He swells up to 3 times his normal size until his body reaches its breaking point. He lets out a wretched scream as his body is torn apart from the inside out, and he explodes in a violent flash of white light. Heaven and earth rejoices. The Black Third tries to retreat, but there is nowhere to run or hide. The rocks have begun to cry out against them, and the waters spit them out. The brimstone dragon was utterly defeated. Lucifer is now back in his angelic body, lying on the ground in complete shock of his defeat. Meanwhile, in heaven the great door opens wider, and the angels gasp and bow their heads. David is down on one knee, covered in blood and still glowing in holy light. His head is bowed and slowly rising as he rises to his feet. He walks over to Lucifer, who is still on the ground, barely able to move. He has returned to his former disgraced form. His wings covered in the blood of his fallen army. "My mother's soul speaks to me, O foul serpent," David says in a calm voice. "She says she will now be your tormentor. She will release you after 1,000 years. Your general Nod, however, will never be released from torment." "Ha!" Lucifer spat. "She does not have the power or the authority to torment anyone, let alone one such as I." David looks up towards heaven and then back down at Lucifer. "You're right, Lucifer, not as Princess Ariana of Nuna, she does not. She has been given a new name, a name that will stand for thousands of years. Every enemy of God shall fear her name and wrath. She will keep this name and this position until God himself comes and frees her. God has a greater purpose for you, fallen one, which is why you will only be tormented by her for 1,000 years instead of for all eternity. Your eternal judgment will come after you fulfill God's plans. Such is the will of God." With those words the soul of Ariana glowed inside the blade of the sword. For she once was the princess of Nuna, but was now transformed into hell. For now the sword is not just a sword, but also a key. The winds of the sky began to hasten the coming of a new age. Lightning and thunder danced freely and the waves of the sea grew frantic. David raises his blade into the air and with a loud voice unto the God in heaven declares, "It is finished. It is time for this world to be cleansed and bring about a new age and new order. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. On earth as it is in heaven." He brings the sword down on Lucifer's chest and everything goes black. The people of Nuna who followed the ways and standards of God were raptured in that moment and were taken to another place. Another world perhaps. The demonic host were all taken directly to hell, where most of them would suffer day and night with no rest for 1,000 years. David brought the sword down upon Lucifer with such force that it literally split the earth, causing a large piece of it to break apart and drift off into space. The belly of the earth spewed onto the remaining land, burning any and everything it touched. Every volcano on earth erupted. Every grain of sand shook in the fury of the dying earth. The world was now in a dark chaos as the sun had been utterly blackened out from the smoke of the burning earth. "Father, unto your hands I commend my spirit." David uttered his last words and was no more. For God took him.